Welcome, class. I'm here in London, and I'm in Scotland Yard. And if I'm not, I'll still say that I'm in Scotland Yard.
You're not far away from Scotland.
Okay. Welcome, class. I'm in London, not far from Scotland Yard, where I am at the headquarters of the National Food Crime Unit with the deputy head, Andy Morling, a gentleman I've met many times and had the pleasure of hearing him present before audiences about the idea of food crimes. And why don't you tell me a little bit about your role and the purpose of this unit?
Okay, we were formed in 2015 off the back of a huge scandal that rocked Europe 2 years previously. This was the horse meat incident, where horse DNA was found in processed beef products. So the year after that, in 2014, the UK government decided that something needed to be done. There needed to be a review. So they commissioned an external expert, Professor Chris Elliott, to conduct a government review of kind of what went wrong, to look at ways in which we can change the way we operate to prevent it happening, and also to deal with when these things do happen in future in a perhaps a more efficient manner. One recommendation that Chris made was that the UK would have its own dedicated unit to deal not with regulatory non-compliance, which is the bulk of offending within the food world, as I'm sure you know, but with that very narrow seam of fraud, serious dishonesty within food supply chains. That unit was to be the National Food Crime Unit. I say we began in March 2015 as a unit, very small scale at that stage. In fact, I think there were 3 people here when I joined at that time in March. Currently, as we stand here at the beginning of 2019, we have approximately 80 staff in post, around 5 locations in the UK, in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Scotland has their own unit, standalone from us, but we cover the other 3 nations of the UK. And our remit is to tackle, as I said, serious offences of dishonesty within food supply chains. We don't deal with other forms of consumer fraud. We don't deal with other aspects of food regulation. We are entirely dedicated to deal with food and food alone, and fraud, intentional acts of fraud against food supply chains. So the only unit, to my knowledge, and I stand to be corrected, things may change, the only unit in the world currently that is dedicated to tackling fraud within the food industry. And I guess you can tell from our sort of huge growth in the last 3 or 4 years just how seriously the UK takes this threat.
Well, and I think that an important clarification that you had made either in Chicago or Minneapolis or one of the places I've heard you speak was that it's not so much an issue of your unit is to make new laws and regulations pertaining to food, but the idea of let's enforce the true criminal laws with fraud that exist.
And that's right. When I joined, one of the things I noticed was that the way of managing non-compliance at a regulatory level in the UK had been a bit of a gentleman's arrangement. It was the investigations were fairly perfunctory, the offences attracted fairly minor sentencing if they ever did reach the court and a conviction, and that clearly had a knock-on effect because those serious non-compliers, serial non-compliers at the low level, sort of nobody cared about food, so that it was a bit of a breeding ground. Today's fraudster, today's food criminal, is yesterday's regulatory non-complier. That's the journey we see, from compliance to non-compliance to fraud. So I felt there was a need to increase the deterrent effect by targeting regulatory offences more keenly and making sure we did deal with regulatory matters, or the agency dealt with the regulatory matters, but a new tier of looking just at the criminal fraud using not only criminal legislation that already exists, but also criminal techniques, policing techniques. So applying policing thinking to what was previously seen as a regulatory problem. And I think it kind of horses for courses, you know, if you pardon the pun. It's about using the right powers that we already have, and the right laws in the UK, to tackle offending that previously was dealt with as a bit of a minor regulatory breach.
Well, that point about being a minor breach, the idea of changing a culture, when you look at the ethics, well, I know it's wrong, but everyone else is doing it, or they look the other way, so I can justify continuing to partake in the fraudulent activity. How difficult was it to kind of start to change this idea of what is a food crime and how do we prosecute it?
Yeah, I think certainly. You mean amongst regulators?
Well, or just
Or
the idea of to go to a court and say that here's the evidence and we need to try it as this, and we need to look differently than we did 5-10 years ago.
I think it's more about turning around the regulator. I think the
Oh.
courts are used to dealing with fraud. There are hundreds and hundreds of serious sized fraud cases taken to court in the UK every year, and they attract the right penalties because there's never been a history of regulatory non-compliance in those areas. So a large banking fraud, for example, is treated as a fraud from the beginning. The regulators recognise when it's not an error or an accident or a mistake, where it's actually intentional, and from the get-go they pursue it as a criminal matter. Traditionally what's happened within food in the UK is we've never even considered that criminal route. The benefits of a standalone unit designed with just that role in mind is that we can start from the beginning as a crime. So we recognise dishonesty when we see it, and we start the whole thing from the beginning as a criminal investigation. When it gets to the stage of getting to the courts recognise it as that too. So the issue wasn't about persuading the courts so much, it was about persuading regulators that it was the right way to go. And the investment in my unit demonstrated that was successful. Sure. But it was a cultural change, there's no doubt about it. It was.
Well, what about that change for consumers? Because I would imagine that many consumers would say that, well, before that horse meat scandal, there was no fraud.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I see year zero for us in the world of food crime in the UK as being 2013 when horse meat hit. Doesn't mean to say it didn't happen before, because we all know it's happened for as long as food has been traded.
Right.
But the recognition that this is somehow different, and I've said it before, but I think there were two things that impacted on the consumers in the UK, and indeed government, and I guess also regulators. And those two things were the fact that there'd been a huge violation of that bond of trust between consumer and supplier. That was one thing. But the bigger, the long-lasting impact of the horse meat incident was the fact that food was shown to be not inviolate. Up until that point, everyone, I think regulators, consumers, industry even, may have seen that no, this doesn't happen in the world of food. It may happen in the automotive industry, it may happen in insurance, it may happen in banking, but fraud of that nature doesn't happen in the food industry. They were wrong. And I think it was, so horse meat was the turning point. I think public realised there was something new happening here, as did government, as did industry, and we are part of the solution to that. I've been working very hard with the US for a number of years now to kind of almost try and prevent the US having to learn from a horse meat type incident, where there was no particular safety implication to it, but a huge deception on consumers.
Well, and that's a, excuse me, that's a big point to bring up, because there was a statement a number of years back in the US about when are we going to wake up about food safety, and someone had said there's going to have to be bodies in the street for us to really start believing in the United States that food safety is an issue. And here, it's almost as if in order for consumers to see that food fraud is an issue, there has to be that true example of a hit to people's trust and reputation, that what they believed in, that the belief has to be broken.
Yeah, I think I might have told you a story before. When I arrived in one city in the States a few years back, I was going to the car rental place, and the guys in the car rental said, "Oh, so what do you do?" And I told them in very simple terms that I work in food crime. And suddenly, within 10 minutes of this conversation beginning, I was filling out my documents. 20 or 30 of the guys from around this car rental place would come around and say, yeah, we're really fascinated by food fraud. We don't think the Americans are dealing with it properly. We don't think we've got a massive problem here with food integrity. And I'm thinking, whoa, and normally I get no interest at all. But here was at a very sort of basic level an indication that consumers in the US do care. And maybe they don't feel that enough is being done at the government level. What I don't want to see is the US have to suffer a horse meat for this to become an issue. And I've certainly noticed a change in the last year or so, where I'm working very closely with colleagues in the US, with the FBI and the FDA, to build a global consensus around this, so we can, if you like, share our learning from the last 5 years with our cousins around the world.
Well, I think that we are starting to change in the United States. Hold on. Maybe I should have had some coffee.
Yeah, maybe you should.
I think we're starting to change how we look at food fraud in the United States. One clear piece of evidence was the Peanut Corporation of America. Though you would say, well, that's not like the horse meat scandal. But there was definitely fraud involved in terms of the fact that the company, the owner of the company, knowingly introduced into commerce food products that he knew was contaminated, and that they falsified documents. And one of the things I talk about is, well, there was a fraud involved in terms of the documentation, as much as if it was what was on the label of a product. And in this case, we also start to see that it's not either food fraud or food safety. No, you can be both.
Yeah.
Easily. You can also be food safety, food fraud, and even food defense.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different ways we can define these, but the sad thing is that in most cases, when we truly have a label, it's already after a consumer has been harmed, one way or form or another.
Yeah.
Or it's been many years, or months or years after the actual incidents started to begin.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point, because when I was designing the unit we currently have, the expanded unit of 80 odd members of staff, modern law enforcement is not about locking people up and that being the sole purpose of law enforcement. Modern law enforcement is about tackling a crime problem. In many respects, the number of cases that my team takes to prosecution, to trial, that's an indication of our failure as a unit. What we need to also invest in, and I think has a greater value in many respects to reduce the threat to consumers, is prevention. And I work very closely with John Spink, who you know from Michigan State, and he's very much a prevention man, as I'm sure you're aware. I've got dedicated teams now working here in the National Food Crime Unit in the UK, whose sole focus is to work with industry to try and help them design out vulnerabilities within their supply chains, to help them look at ingenious new ways to reduce the vulnerability and also to deter offenders from offending. That's unusual. 15 years ago, it would have been seen as heresy in the UK to waste resources that we've seen on prevention. Now it is very much the gold standard. So we're attacking the food crime problem from multiple different dimensions simultaneously. And as I said, it's not all about prosecuting people, because that's a sign that the harms happen to the consumer at that stage. I want to stop it happening in the first place.
Sure.
I want to remove the threat, remove the vulnerability, so that we can be a hostile environment to offenders in the first place. That's the real way to tackle a crime, in my view.
Would I be correct in assuming that your team of now 80 some odd individuals, very diverse backgrounds and skill sets, they're not all
Absolutely.
like police detectives?
Absolutely.
So there's scientists, there are food experts,
We have the whole range.
series.
The only criteria to come and work at National Food Crime Unit is that you're a very bright person, and we're fortunate to have amongst the brightest of law enforcement. My background, I'm a crime guy. I've been in crime, investigating crime for 30 odd years now, a range of crime types. There are a few others with similar backgrounds, but I would say probably the majority of people we have now are people from other backgrounds. So people who have, we've got people from the food industry, we have people from an academic background, we have analytical staff, and that just adds to what we can do. It brings new ideas to this problem. I think it's diversifying more now than it was in the first couple of years, because I think we needed to have that policing mentality, that lens to look at the problem through for the first couple of years. Now we're established, and that is our operating model. We need food industry knowledge. We need people who understand how food works. I understand how crime works, but I'm still learning every day about how the food industry works, and quite frankly, I'm sure it will be until the end of my career, because it's a complex and nuanced area. But absolutely that. We are a unit that's made up of a variety of backgrounds, including regulatory backgrounds, and I think that is to our strength.
Well, you've addressed the idea of the diversity of your unit, but you're talking about a unit here in an industry that is so global. There's got to be some limitations to what you can do and where you can go.
Of course, I mean, it's 80 staff is still not a lot when you're looking to try and change the world in some respects, because we in the UK import around half of our food from around the world. I recognised that for two reasons. One, that fact alone means we should be operating at an international level. There's no point in just building a ring of steel around the UK. We need to work with developing capability in particularly the developing world, where a lot of our food ingredients come from. But also there's a moral obligation upon us, because we are the only unit in the world that does this. It's really important, I think, as a public servant in a global sense, important that we share that love around our partners. So I set up at the beginning of last year, I think I launched it at the Minneapolis event, I think, where we met.
At the
Global Alliance.
Defense,
The
with
Food
the
Defence
defense,
Conference,
yes.
that's right. So this is the Global Alliance on Food Crime. I'm enormously proud of what we've achieved in the last couple of years on that. This is a grouping of law enforcement partners from what we know as the Five Eyes in the UK. So this is UK, Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand. Law enforcement functions from those nations. So I think in a couple of situations there, food regulatory bodies. In the US it's the FBI as our representative, and we represent the UK. And we're now on our third meeting scheduled for May of this year. And the idea behind that is to share our experiences collectively across the developed world, or countries that represent a large chunk of the developed world, to make sure we can set up almost like a baseline for what a good response to food crime looks like. And if we can get that commonality across those five nations, it's then about sharing that out to the developing world. Each of those five nations has strategic interests in a particular part of the world. The US, for example, has an interest in Central and South America. Australia has an interest in Southeast Asia. And we can start selling that model to those nations that just happen to be the same nations that provide our food ingredients for us, where there have been traditionally challenges with authenticity that are way beyond anything that we've seen in the developed world. So it's a 5 or 10 year plan, but it's set off in the right direction. Got huge support from all five nations. There are activities currently going on, deliverables currently being worked on around those five nations that were instigated by the Global Alliance. And I think it's got a good future ahead of it. I really do. And the FBI's contribution from the US has been significant. It was a huge coup to get the FBI representing the US, because they can bring that law enforcement focus to a problem that hasn't necessarily had that focus previously.
Well, and that focus, you were talking about the diversity of the people you work with and the scale of the job at hand. I would imagine that to some extent, not marketing like for hiring new people or marketing to sell something, but in a way to sell the idea that if we can't have integrity of our food, then that has to have a cultural impact. The idea of protecting the culture, the identity of whether it's London or Europe or the other nations involved, of their cultural identity. I think that of the major concerns in terms of food reputation, food authenticity, food integrity is perhaps most closely tied to identity and culture.
I think you're right. I think there are so many people say to me, why does food crime matter? What's the big deal? Why do you deserve to have government money spent on a unit like yours? There are so many reasons why food crime matters. It matters for the reasons you mentioned around, a nation's culture is in some ways defined by its cuisine in some respects, and the integrity of its food system. It matters from an economic sense, a macroeconomic sense. It matters to the well-being of a nation, particularly exporting nations such as your own and mine. We are key players in the global food industry. It matters to us at that sort of macro level. But what really gets me out of bed in the morning is the more micro stuff. It matters at a very personal level. There is genuinely, in my view, nothing more important to us as human beings than what we take into our body. The ultimate consent we have is what we take into our body. That consent should always, in every situation, be informed consent. When somebody defrauds us in relation to food, we are uniquely vulnerable as consumers. There's no way you and I easily can tell what we're putting into our bodies is authentic. So that consent is taken away from us in a criminal sense. I think that's one of the gravest crimes you can commit. Mm-hmm. To take away somebody's ability, somebody's agency to decide what they put into their own bodies.
Well, let's put this to task. Is it food fraud if I want to drink almond milk and I buy a package of almond milk and there's not a lot of almond product in it?
Yeah, that's a really important distinction, and quite often a lot of the intelligence my unit receives is about those kind of things. Now, provided the almond milk you're drinking is not misdescribed in any way, then in the eyes of the law, it is not a crime. It's not crossed that Rubicon into criminality. Whether it's ethical, whether it's deceptive in a non-criminal sense, that's a really subjective thing to be able to make a view on. But fraud is not. It's a wider issue. Food integrity, food authenticity is a wider issue than just fraud, in my view. My role is to tackle the fraudulent where it is actually a criminal offence.
So if the package says contains only 2% almond product, that's one thing. But if it says 100%
Yeah.
and it's really not, then there's deception at play.
That's where the problem is. And we had an example of that 18 months, 2 years ago, where we were looking at trying to profile. I don't know if I presented this to you in Minneapolis, but there are certain characteristics of food products that make them more vulnerable to fraud than others. And we're looking at what our intelligence was telling us, because the value of criminal intelligence is when you look at it in piecemeal form, it doesn't tell you a great deal. When you look at it collectively, it can give you huge insights into where to target your focus, if you like, looking for fraud. And we found there were maybe 5 or 6 different factors that if a food product ticked those boxes, that was a fairly high indication of potential fraud. Let's say one of those factors that was quite significant in this particular case was consumer discernment. So if you imagine a new product that comes and we in the West tend to receive an awful lot of new fad products that become fashionable for a short period of time real quick. We don't necessarily know what good tastes like. We don't necessarily know what good looks like, or the texture, whether it's kind of just right or not. So that's a huge indicator of fraud, because the fraudsters know that we don't know what it looks like or tastes like. So we found these 5 or 6 factors that if you overlay them all, and a product sits within the middle of that Venn diagram, that's a fairly good place to target proactive sampling. So we did. So we used that profiling model to select a product, to look for products that fall right in that sweet spot where they were a huge consumer demand, low consumer discernment, supply chains, efficiencies, overlaid them all, and we found one product that shone very brightly, and that was coconut water. 100% coconut water from Southeast Asia. So we spent a little bit of money, not a lot, in sampling the first consignment we had into the UK of 100% coconut water, and we found it was adulterated with a non-naturally occurring sugar. And we thought we just struck lucky, so we'll try another one. And we tried another one, and that too had the presence of this non-naturally occurring sugar. Now, of course, what should be in coconut water of that quality should be nothing but coconut water, and the label made it absolutely clear. By the end of the exercise, we had found 400 tonnes of coconut water that was not as it's meant to be. Now, I'm sure you, as someone who understands this industry or the way food fraud works, can recognise that the presence of that sweetener was actually not an issue on its own. It's what it indicated. What we found was happening was that if you can imagine, as a producer, you have a pint of coconut water, and you pour out half that coconut water into another package, and you top it up with water, you're going to lose the sweetness profile. So you add a bit of cane sugar back into it, and you and I wouldn't know the difference.
Yeah.
Because quite frankly, in my opinion, it's all horrible stuff. I don't like it at all. But so
I love coconuts, but I hate coconut water.
Precisely. So, but you wouldn't know good from indifferent from bad. And so the reality was, you imagine that 50-50 swapping over a coconut water with, so you're stretching out your coconut water supplies by 100%.
Well, and I think the scenario you're describing is something that falls perfectly aligned with a scenario that we had talked about before. The idea of if you buy the fish versus a fillet, versus a frozen block, versus a powder, the more processed and manufactured and in some cases made convenient, the more vulnerable or the more likelihood of fraud being evidenced.
And the more we ask for different characteristics anyway. So even in the fish in its raw form, its whole form, there's still potentially a number of different things there. Is it line caught? Is it farmed? Or all those kind of things.
Is it from this country or that country?
Exactly. I mean, and there are just, if you take one solitary fish on its own, as you say, from powdered fish right up to the origin, there are so many opportunities amongst them. And I think because we've changed in the way we consume food in the West, there isn't just one choice of fish now. There are many dozens, and that's a fantastic thing. But also there are introduced additional fraud risks, because I couldn't choose line caught sea bass when I was a child. I couldn't even choose sea bass probably because it wasn't available to me. So it's great that we've got that, and I wouldn't ever want to lose that variety of sourcing and product type. But we just need to be aware that the harder these claims are to justify, the more opportunity there is for a fraudster, particularly when it comes down to a document, where it isn't anything to do with the intrinsic, it's something you can't test for in DNA, but something that relies on the accuracy of a document. Documents have been defrauded for as long as there have been documents, and it's not difficult, particularly in 2019, where computers can do a number of things, printers can do a number of things that will change.
Well, and an item I brought up yesterday was all this hype about blockchain. It's just more big data, more documents, and the more documents, the more opportunity you have for...
Don't start me on blockchain, Darin. I'm a blockchain denier, I have to say.
I've been called the same. I mean, hey, I hope it works, but it's not that easy.
But it's human nature, when something big goes wrong, to look for a silver bullet, to look for something that will resolve the problem as quickly as it's materialised. It's just human nature, and I understand that. People were looking to blockchain, hopefully less so now, but certainly in 2018 and 2017 it was a big deal. And when you bring it down to its simplest, it is just bulletproof traceability.
Yeah.
There is nothing stopping you or me in a food business from going to the end of our supply chain, insisting that we get every single thing that will allow us to trace it and put it on an Excel spreadsheet. Nothing to stop us doing that now. Blockchain doesn't add anything to that.
Right.
So unless somebody, a retailer or anyone else is going to go to that degree and get every single product, every single piece of traceability data, blockchain won't solve it for them.
Well, and one of my fears is that blockchain, if it's looked at, I mean, if it's used as much as it's being described today, it's a purely reactive element that is going to be sold as something that's going to make your food safer, and consumers are going to be paying more for food that use blockchain. But in reality, it really is making more of an effort to protect the food companies rather than protect the consumers. I describe it as, it's almost as if blockchain used reactively is like an airbag in a car. Whereas you also need to wear the seatbelt, and you put the seatbelt on to be proactive in predicting that something could happen. You have to have both. You can't have just the airbag without the seatbelt.
That's a really good analogy. And you don't drive your car recklessly because you know you've got an airbag.
Right.
I think it's a real worry to me that we are just placing too much emphasis on one technical tool. There isn't a simple solution to this. It is years and years of hard graft and people caring. The challenge I have with industry, and the challenge that I had on day one, and I have the same challenge on day 1000 or what I'm at now, is getting industry to genuinely share suspicions with the unit. With any other crime type, if you think of a banking fraud, if you had your online bank account hacked or whatever, you found that out when you get back to the US, the first thing you would do would be what? Call the police.
Right.
Yeah. You, the victim, would highlight to the police.
Actually, you know what? I think that most people would talk to their bank before.
Okay, go to the bank. Okay,
Sure.
fine.
But the point
is,
I'm making though is how many people wouldn't think of there's a crime, I need to call the police.
Yeah,
Same
there's
as
a crime has happened.
I got sick, it must be something I ate, I'm going to contact the health department.
Yeah. But the ultimate, there'd be nothing stopping you when the police are ultimately told, probably by your bank, from giving the police a full disclosure of what's happened.
Right.
Yeah?
Right.
In the food industry, it's not like that, and I often challenge people, and I know a lot of people in the food industry, from big companies. I say, okay, so if you found a fraud within your supply chain, so you weren't the suspect, you were the victim of this, because it is a business-to-business fraud. If you found a fraud within your supply chain, what would you do? Okay, well, I would speak to the supplier, and I would ask what's going on. I'd demand answers. I would fine the supplier, or I would delist the supplier, depending on the scale of it. I may recall the product, depending on how things, whether it's a safety issue or not, but I would deal with it contractually. Okay, so what's missing from that scenario? Contacting me. I said, would you call me? No. Because there's such a huge concern in industry that doing that would damage their brand.
Sure.
And I can understand that. I totally get where they're coming from, that it focuses more attention, and ultimately, if it was ever released to the public, it would say that ABC Limited had been unwittingly selling authentic food to their suppliers. Unwittingly would be forgotten about. It would look like they'd done it in a way.
Well, because people don't know. They say, "Oh, I got this at this restaurant or at this retailer." They don't think, oh, it came from this
Came from- yeah,
distributor
absolutely.
or from
Yeah,
this
yeah.
processing, or they never know those names of those companies. It goes back to the biggest name.
Absolutely. So I've been at pains to say to them, that doesn't solve the problem. That just displaces it. So your errant supplier just lies low for a few months and then joins the market again in another sector or another part of the food industry, or supplies another retailer. You haven't solved the problem. And there are certain things in life that we as a society, globally, consider to be so serious that they justify making something a crime. There are some things in life that are less serious, and therefore contractual resolution is legitimate. But society is based on some things being beyond that, being a crime. I liken to things like domestic abuse, violence within relationships. So difficult to get victims to come forward for different reasons, but that's why that is such a challenging crime to investigate. We're the same problem, because the victims are not coming forward.
Your example, though, highlights the concept, though, that economics is at play.
Yeah.
I don't want to report this person who's abusing me because I can't afford to live on my own. I can't afford to move out. I can't afford to leave this job. I can't afford to do something different.
Yeah, and that's a really good analogy, because so in the domestic violence situation, that's the economic, reason not to. But the same applies in industry. I can't afford to lose this supplier. Some suppliers are too big to fail. If I don't buy my poultry from that supplier, then who do I buy it from? So I don't want to send them out of business, because if I do, then I have no poultry on my shelves.
Is it as simple, though, as I know that there's fraud involved, but I'm paying a great price. If I have to get it from some more reputable, ethical, non-fraudulent supplier, my customers won't buy it at this price. Or if they buy it at this price, I'm making less of a profit.
You're absolutely right, and that is the huge paradox. You hear industry saying, we want to rid our industry of the wrongdoers, but actually when it comes down to it, are they willing to contribute to that? And I've said to industry, and I'll say it again to you, I would move heaven and earth to protect the brand of a victim. My whole career, from dealing with child sexual abuse, dealing with tax fraud many years ago, it's all about, for me, protecting the victim. My job is to protect the victim. In a food fraud, a major retailer could be the victim. I want to do what I can to protect them. I will seek reporting restrictions in a trial, if necessary, to try to keep their name out of public domain. And it's possible. It happens with malicious tampering in the food defence world. The courts recognise the potential damage to a brand, as do the police service. So we work hard to protect that industry, but it's still an awful lot easier not to pick up the phone to me, isn't it? And I find that an ethically challenging problem that I haven't got an answer to, other than put in place these measures. And if I need a test case, I need a company to come to me and tell me what's happened, watch what then unfolds, watch that they don't end up having their brand damaged further than it has been by the fraud, and word will then spread around the industry. But until we have that first mover who's got the moral, their moral compass is so well tuned that they do come to me, then we're never going to deal with this problem. That's more important to me than blockchain.
The bigger messaging, aside from blockchain, aside from many of those buzzwords that capture media attention, the idea of victim. I mean, we talk about the idea of, is it a crime, but the idea of victim. One could say, well, okay, so I was eating horse meat, so what? Was I really a victim? It tasted good, right? Are there times where it's hard to kind of understand or to communicate who the real victim is? It's not necessarily the person who was deceived, but is it possibly that there is a person in another country, a worker, a landowner, someone else who's not right here in London, who is part of the bigger picture of the victims in these crimes?
As in having made a loss as a result of it, in terms of their working conditions, those kind of things, you mean? Or do you mean a genuine financial loss? It
could be financial loss, it could be the idea of perhaps, I'm just running some scenarios through my mind, it's advertised as being a product from this place, but in reality it's from some other place. Or it's an example of fair trade and ethical, but in reality there's forced labor involved, or there's some other conditions involved.
I mean,
and we just want to have something that tastes good.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of potential ills around food production, I'm sure you're aware, the whole fair trade thing and whatever. I wouldn't necessarily make them victims of the food fraud, but make them victims of the wider wider problems that might exist within the global food industry. The reality is that the only crime I know like this, it is a business-to-business crime. It is 99% of the time anyway, where one food business is defrauding another food business. But the difference is that's not where the loss sticks or the loss is felt. Is that the loss is felt because it invariably gets passed on to the consumers. So there's a degree of plausible deniability within. If you're a retailer and you are unwittingly buying fraudulent product from your supplier and selling it to your customer, you're passing on any loss. So why is there a massive incentive for you to even challenge and tackle it? Because if you're paying more than you should, top dollar or over top dollar for fraudulent product, you're making your consumers do the same. So you suffer no loss in that. You only get a loss when it actually gets recognised as a fraud. So the longer, as a business, you can keep it from being recognised as a fraud, hopefully forever, you will not suffer any loss of market share, you'll not suffer any loss of consumer confidence. But that's not the way it should work, Darin. That's not the way it should work. That's not about personal integrity and corporate social responsibility. There's an obligation, there's an ethical one on businesses to make sure what they sell is legitimate. I don't think they're really warm to that yet. Not everyone.
Well, and the opposite end of that, not being warm to it yet, I don't think there'll ever be an end to the concern over food integrity.
Yeah, I wonder how much the public care. I mean, I guess you alluded to that earlier. You know, if it tastes good, it's fine. If the price point is right, particularly at the sort of lower income levels, price is all. You know, and how much more are we as a society willing to pay for our food to have that guaranteed authenticity, whether it's through blockchain or whether it's just through, you know, generally upticking of quality standards around the supply chain. Would we pay twice as much for our chicken breasts in a high street store? I'm not sure we would. Some would. Maybe the middle classes would,
But should there be almost like a class system? Like
it becomes almost
some
like
people pay this, and you know there's not much integrity.
Yeah.
Some people are willing to pay this. It becomes a very strange supply and demand curve.
It does.
For food integrity.
It does. And I think provided the consumer can make an informed choice, I would never want to take that choice away from people. If people want to eat poorer quality food, then provided they have an informed ability to make that choice themselves, and as I said, put into their body what they know they're putting into their body rather than something else, I can live with that. But it's when they don't know. So when, I keep coming back to chicken for some reason, but when perhaps the chicken breast has gone beyond its expiry date and has been redated and sold to them, that's not right. It may be poor quality chicken and they're paying for that, but at least they know what they're buying. Right. If it's been redated or it's been kicked around on the floor of the production line and then put back into a package, that's not right. And I think but there is an issue around cultural class, this and everything else. You know, we're big on class in the UK. I have an issue with Manuka honey, for example. Now there's as you know, a often defrauded product.
Very much so.
But given its price point, does that have a massive impact on the people that pay my wages? The majority of the public in this country, probably not. Because if you can afford to buy Manuka honey, then to some extent that's a very niche market, isn't it? So I'm more concerned at the frauds that hit the wider populace than that sort of niche top end authenticity issues.
Makes sense. In wrapping up, I've asked this question of others, and this is one of the questions that's asked of me all the time. Knowing what I know, I still have to eat food.
Yeah.
Knowing what you know, how has what you've learned in your job affected when you go out to a restaurant, when you go to the grocery store, when you are home with your family? You can't necessarily just flip a switch, I would imagine.
No,
turn that off.
That's a really good question. The first thing I'll say is it hasn't changed it as much as I thought it would. My wife and my parents asked me the same question. You know, does it change how you perceive food and the likely to get unsafe or inauthentic food? It doesn't, because I know this is a very small part of the industry. The food in the UK, the vast majority of food in the UK, as it is in the US, is safe and authentic. The vast majority. In any walk of life, there's a small seam of fraud, and we face that every time we buy anything in the store, whether it's food or otherwise. What it has made me do is look more closely at the claims and the ingredients and the nutritional value and those kind of things. And that's more about my broader experience of working in the food regulatory sphere. So I'm now more aware of ingredients, more aware of claims, and I look very carefully at the label and the packaging more than I ever did before. but I don't worry about food not being authentic in the UK because I don't think statistically I'm going to have much interaction with it in the major retailers in the UK. And that's a great thing. Part of my job is to keep it that way.
Very good, very good. I thank you. I think my students will also appreciate the fact that hearing directly from someone who is looking at this, who is communicating with other countries and other agencies, looking at this from a bigger system strategy viewpoint as opposed to focusing on the one incident,
Sure.
when you can make those stronger connections and, like you said, realize that in the bigger picture of things, it may capture the headlines of the newspaper, but it's really a small percent of what really is going on out there. I think that balance between the airbag and the seatbelt, we should always want to wear the seatbelt when it comes to food safety or food integrity, but know that that's the right thing to do, even if we recognize that there's only a small percentage of players in the industry that are going to be fraudulent.
I think that's right, and I think food is very visceral, and I've likened it before to my previous role dealing with child sexual abuse. It is something that we feel very strongly about because it is part of who we are. And my biggest surprise in the last 4 years of doing this is the degree to which the news media in the UK, as it represents the public, I guess, in some respects, are fascinated by this. If I were to mention in a media interview a particular product that we were looking at, a particular type of product, it would be front page news the next day. We care that much in the UK about it. It's such a visceral thing to us that it would be all over the newspapers and I'd be out of a job probably because the industry would be massively damaged. So I have to walk that very fine line between dealing with the problems that we are aware of and identifying new problems to deal with and creating a sensationalist panic, moral panic in the country, which is totally unnecessary and totally unfounded. So my job is to kind of...
Probably counterproductive.
Indeed it is. Indeed it is. We want people can trust the food that they eat in this country. People can trust it. They just need to use a bit of common sense sometimes. Buy through formal channels. Be aware of ingredients. Be aware of claims and what they really mean. And just be educated consumers. I guess that's part of my agency's wider job to do just that.
Well, I thank you for not only speaking with me and with my students today, but also for taking on such an incredible task ahead of you. One that I have no idea how one could say, here's the light at the end of the tunnel. How can you identify SMART goals other than it is an incremental process? And I want to make sure that you know that how much of an impact you've made and over the years, not only in terms of what you do, but also in talking with me and really helping me see food integrity differently. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Darin. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.